Hey guys! Tonight, we're going to drift back, way back, to the marble chill of ancient Rome. The streets are quiet, the statues are judging you, and the empire is, honestly, kind of falling apart, but trying not to look like it. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's talk about a man who built walls when he couldn't build friendships. A man who loved Greek philosophy, architecture, and, most controversially, his boyfriend. Yes, we're talking about the Roman Emperor Hadrian. Rome's most cultured control freak. Born in 76 CE, Publius Aelius Hadrianus was one of those people who somehow seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. He was technically from Spain, well, the Roman province of Hispania, but he'd probably roll his eyes if you called him Spanish. He liked to think of himself as Greek. Or, as he would have said, a Greekulus, which literally means a little Greek. It was meant as an insult, but Hadrian took it as a personality. Now, Hadrian's family was rich, of course. They were one of those colonial elites who made their fortune managing estates and pretending not to notice that most of their wealth came from people doing all the work for them. Young Hadrian lost his parents early, which was sad, but, like every conveniently orphaned Roman boy in history, it made him someone else's political responsibility. That someone else was his cousin, Marcus Ulpius Traianus. You might know him as Emperor Trajan. Yes, that Trajan, the one whose name became shorthand for the good old days. So, Hadrian basically grew up as Trajan's slightly annoying, bookish shadow. He followed him everywhere. He tried to impress him with military service, poetry, and what we might now call a vibe of intense overachievement. When Trajan became emperor, Hadrian was right there at the edge of the spotlight, smiling too hard. Now, if you ever worked in an office, you know exactly the type, the guy who knows all the rules, follows none of them, and somehow ends up with the promotion. That was Hadrian. He climbed every rung of the Roman career ladder, military tribune, quaestor, governor, like he was playing a very serious round of the empire, the role-playing game. But here's the thing, Hadrian wasn't Trajan's obvious heir. Trajan didn't have kids, and Rome didn't do peaceful successions very well. They liked to keep things dramatic. So when Trajan died in 117 CE, the imperial palace conveniently announced, right afterward, that Hadrian had been adopted as his successor. By a signed document. That was allegedly signed by Trajan's widow. After Trajan was already dead. Yes. That's suspicious. Even the Romans, who were professionals of political weirdness, went, him. But by then, Hadrian had control of the army, and the army didn't do handwriting analysis. So congratulations, Hadrian was emperor. And the first thing he did was undo most of what Trajan did. Trajan had been the classic expand everything emperor, conquering territories left and right. Hadrian looked at all that and said, nope. Too much work. He basically Marie Kondo'd the empire. Anything that didn't spark joy or profit, he let go of. He pulled Roman troops out of Mesopotamia and Armenia, which historians still debate about, but honestly, it was the most sensible thing he ever did. Hadrian's main hobby, besides micromanagement, was travel. He spent about half his reign wandering around the empire like a man trying to visit every Airbnb in Europe. While most emperors sat in Rome, issuing decrees and pretending to be divine, Hadrian was out there inspecting forts, chatting with soldiers, and lecturing local governors on aqueduct design. He loved architecture, really loved it. To the point where he would personally redesign buildings just because he could. When he wasn't reorganizing the army or drawing floor plans, Hadrian was busy cultivating his image as the philosopher king. He grew a beard, a big, curly, Greek-style beard. This was revolutionary, because Roman emperors were usually clean-shaven. Hadrian's beard said, "I read Plato and I'm not afraid to look pretentious." Within a few decades, everyone copied him. Basically, he was the influencer who made philosopher beards a trend. Let's float over to another part of his life, the personal side. Because, oh, there's drama. Hadrian was married, technically. His wife was Vibia Sabina, Trajan's grandniece. So yes, it was all very keep it in the family, as usual. Sabina was elegant, educated, and absolutely miserable. The marriage was political and loveless, and Hadrian spent most of it pretending she didn't exist. He once wrote her a letter praising her virtues, by listing things she didn't do wrong. Which is kind of like saying, "I love how you never throw things at me." But then there was Antinous. Antinous. The beautiful young man from Bithynia who changed everything. Hadrian met him around 123 CE, and let's just say, it was instant obsession. Antinous was everything Hadrian wanted to be: young, Greek, athletic, and probably tired of being stared at by an emperor. Hadrian took him everywhere: tours, hunts, ceremonies, and even had him appear in official art. It was the ancient Roman version of a very public relationship. And then, in 130 CE, during one of their travels in Egypt, Antinous drowned in the Nile. The official story is vague. He fell in. Or maybe it was ritual sacrifice. Or maybe it was suicide. The truth doesn't matter much now, because Hadrian never recovered. He mourned Antinous with a depth that startled everyone. He deified him, made him a literal god. He founded a city in his name, Antinopolis. He flooded the empire with statues of him, idealized, perfect, frozen in marble. There are more surviving statues of Antinous than almost any other ancient figure, except emperors. Hadrian basically immortalized his grief. After that, something in him hardened. He became reclusive, bitter, and increasingly authoritarian. He started ordering purges of senators he didn't trust, because nothing says "I'm fine" like a few well-timed executions. He built walls, literally. Most famously, Hadrian's Wall, across the north of Britain, which was less a defense system and more an expensive line in the dirt. It symbolized his philosophy perfectly: this far, and no further. I'm tired. Let's drift into the later years of his reign, when the philosopher king was mostly just the king part. Hadrian got sick. Painfully, chronically, unpredictably sick. Modern scholars think it might have been heart failure or kidney disease. Whatever it was, it left him bloated, breathless, and furious at the world. He isolated himself in his luxurious villa at Tivoli, a massive complex with lakes, temples, and replicas of his favorite places. A kind of ancient theme park of nostalgia there. He spent his final years rearranging his furniture, micromanaging his legacy, and trying to find someone, anyone, he could trust to take over. He adopted Lucius Aelius Caesar, who immediately died. So, naturally, he adopted Antoninus Pius, on the condition that Antoninus would then adopt two more heirs, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. Because why not overcomplicate succession one more time? When Hadrian finally died in 138 CE, Rome was relieved. He had built magnificent structures, stabilized the borders, and left behind an empire more organized than when he found it. But personally, he was remembered as cold, difficult, and maybe just a little too in love with marble boys. Still, his wall stands. His architecture still shapes Rome, and his statues of Antinous remain hauntingly beautiful, eternal monuments to love, control, and the exhaustion of trying to hold an empire together. Let's float out on that thought. Hadrian, the man who tried to rebuild the world and ended up building a shrine to grief instead. Hey guys, Welcome back. If you're still awake, first of all, congratulations, you've already outlasted half of the Roman Senate. Tonight, we're staying with Emperor Hadrian a little longer. Because the man didn't just build an empire, he built an entire mood. Now, when you hear a Hadrian's Wall, you probably imagine a massive, impenetrable fortress stretching across misty hills, crawling with Roman soldiers heroically fending off barbarians. In reality, it was a really long fence. A very expensive, very stone-heavy fence. About 73 miles long, running across northern Britain, roughly where England ends and Scotland begins, or, more accurately, where the Romans gave up. See, the empire was tired. Hadrian was tired. The legions were tired. The Britons were, of course, angry. So instead of expanding further north, Hadrian looked at the map and basically said, let's just not. He ordered the wall built in 122 CE to mark Rome's limit, and, perhaps, to make a statement. This is mine. Everything beyond it? Someone else's problem. It was about 10 feet wide, 15 feet tall, lined with forts, gates, and watchtowers every Roman mile. But the real purpose wasn't so much defense as definition. It was Hadrian drawing a line in the landscape, literally, and saying, I'm done playing empire. The soldiers stationed there spent most of their time patrolling, chatting with local Britons, and complaining about the weather. Because northern England in winter is not exactly the Mediterranean. And of course, Hadrian had to visit it himself. He loved to personally inspect his projects, probably driving everyone mad in the process. Imagine your emperor showing up, asking why the stones weren't arranged symmetrically, and then redesigning your gatehouse on the spot. That was Hadrian. Micromanagement, but make it imperial. He also left little artistic touches everywhere he went. Shrines, inscriptions, even statues. Hadrian loved statues the way some people love selfies. He couldn't resist leaving one behind. Especially if it was of Antinous. Now, let's drift gently into that marble labyrinth again, the story of Antinous after Antinous. Because while the boy drowned, the myth did not. After his death in the Nile, Hadrian did what every emotionally unstable emperor with unlimited resources would do. He made Antinous into a god. Literally. He announced that Antinous had risen to divine status. His spirit merged with Osiris, the Egyptian god of rebirth. A new cult began, the cult of Antinous. And it spread across the empire faster than you'd expect for something based entirely on grief and aesthetic. Temples popped up from Egypt to Athens to Rome itself. Cities built statues of the new god, always idealized, serene, eternally youthful. Priests were appointed. Festivals were held. And coins were minted with Antinous' face, which was a level of devotion usually reserved for, actual emperors. It was probably the only time in Roman history that a man's boyfriend became a widespread religious figure. And yes, that made a lot of people uncomfortable. The Roman elite whispered about it in marble hallways, half scandalized, half intrigued. But what could they do? Hadrian was emperor. If he wanted his lost love to be a god, then that was that. Scholars still debate whether the cult was sincere or performative, but honestly, it was both. Hadrian truly adored Antinous, and he also understood how to turn grief into propaganda. A beautiful young god, born from tragedy, whose worship reminded everyone of the emperor's divine connection. That's a political win and a personal therapy session rolled into one. The city of Antinopolis, built on the Nile where he drowned, became the heart of this devotion. It was laid out with perfect Greek order, symmetrical streets, temples, and statues lining the main avenue. Hadrian designed it himself, because of course he did. Even in mourning, he couldn't resist giving architectural notes. If you walked through Antinopolis in its prime, you'd see marble colonnades glowing in the Egyptian sun, priests in white robes chanting prayers to Antinous Osiris, and visitors leaving offerings of flowers and perfume. It must have been beautiful, haunting, and just slightly unsettling, like a city built out of nostalgia. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Hadrian was making his own architectural dreams come true. He wasn't content to just live in the imperial palace. He wanted something grander, quieter, and, above all, customized. So he built Villa Adriana, near Tivoli. Calling it a villa is kind of like calling Versailles a cozy weekend cabin. It was enormous. Spread across nearly 100 hectares, it had palaces, baths, theatres, libraries, and even artificial lakes. And because Hadrian missed his travels, he recreated bits of the empire inside it. There was a miniature Nile, a replica of Athens Academy, and a building modelled after the Egyptian Canopus Canal. Basically, a museum of memories where every corridor whispered, "I remember when you were happier?" Hadrian filled it with art, Greek sculptures, frescoes, mosaics, all carefully arranged to reflect his intellectual tastes. And yes, there were statues of Antinous. Everywhere. Dozens of them. Each one slightly different, but all sharing that same soft melancholy in marble. You couldn't walk 10 feet in that villa without seeing his face. It was like living inside a love letter carved out of stone. But beneath the elegance, there was a strange loneliness. Hadrian's court had become a mix of philosophers, poets, architects, and terrified bureaucrats. He wanted people to admire him, but he also wanted to be left alone. He hosted lavish banquets, then retreated into solitude. He was the emperor of contradictions. And as his health declined, those contradictions deepened. By his later years, Hadrian was more statue than man, stoic, distant, increasingly embittered. His illness, possibly heart failure, or a kidney condition, left him swollen and gasping. He grew paranoid, suspicious of everyone. Even his chosen heir, Antoninus, kept his distance. Yet, through all that pain, Hadrian kept building. He commissioned his own mausoleum, the massive circular structure that still stands in Rome today, later renamed Castel Sant'Angelo. It was the perfect symbol of him, colossal, symmetrical, impressive, and fundamentally closed off. A monument to control and perfection. When death finally came in 138 CE, Hadrian's reputation was complicated. He'd been a good administrator, a brilliant builder, and a visionary ruler. But also aloof, obsessive, and emotionally volatile. The Senate even tried to deny him deification at first, which, for an emperor, was kind of the ancient version of being left unread. Eventually, Antoninus Pius convinced them to change their minds. They made Hadrian a god too. Probably to keep the peace. And so, the philosopher-emperor joined his marble beloved in eternity, both turned into divine ideals, worshipped for centuries by people who would never know how human and complicated they'd actually been. Today, when we look at Hadrian's wall, or the ruins of his villa, or the serene face of Antinous in a museum case, we see traces of that strange legacy. A ruler who built the edges of empire, but couldn't fix the cracks in himself. A man who could command legions but not his own grief. And an emperor who, in the end, might have just wanted a little peace. Let's drift out on that image. Hadrian, standing among the stones of his villa, staring at the setting sun, surrounded by statues of the one he loved and the empire he couldn't stop trying to perfect. He was the ruler of the known world. And still, somehow, utterly alone. If you've made it this far, you've survived the emotional labyrinth that was Hadrian's love life and the architectural therapy sessions that followed. So, let's dim the lamps, tuck in, and drift into the final chapter of his life's echo, his legacy. Because Hadrian might have died, but his walls, temples, and very complicated feelings lived on. You see, Hadrian didn't just build things, he curated the Roman world. He treated the empire like one big art gallery that needed better lighting and symmetry. Where earlier emperors were obsessed with conquest, Hadrian was obsessed with order. Every province had to look, feel, and behave like a polished piece of his personal vision board. He wasn't content to rule an empire, he wanted to design it. And honestly, he almost pulled it off. Take architecture. Hadrian's reign reshaped Roman style from the ground up. He didn't invent the dome, but he fell in love with it the way some people fall in love with coffee or Greek poetry. The most famous example, of course, is the Pantheon. Now, technically, the Pantheon wasn't his idea. It was originally built under Agrippa a century earlier. But Hadrian rebuilt it after fire destroyed the original, and he made it iconic. You know that perfect, circular dome with the open oculus that lets the light pour in like divine spotlighting? That's Hadrian's doing. It's 142 feet across, still one of the largest unreinforced concrete domes in the world. To this day, engineers stare at it and quietly whisper, "Eh, how?" Hadrian didn't even put his own name on the inscription. It still says Agrippa built this, which was either humility or the most passive-aggressive way of saying, I improved your design but sure, let's credit you. Classic Hadrian. And then there was Villa Adriana, which he built not as a home, but as a statement. Walking through it was like walking through his mind, every courtyard a thought, every statue a memory. He recreated places that mattered to him, the Lyceum, the Canopus, the Vale of Tempe. It was a microcosm of the empire, filled with pools reflecting stars, corridors of carved marble, and quiet spaces meant for philosophy, or maybe just for brooding in expensive silence. Because Hadrian was a thinker. He liked to play philosopher, though he wasn't exactly Socrates. He read everything, wrote poetry, debated metaphysics, and invited Greek intellectuals to dine with him. If you were a poet or a mathematician in the 2nd century, you wanted that dinner invitation. But you also knew to tread lightly. Hadrian could argue for hours about Stoic ethics and still have you exiled if you disagreed too loudly. A real let's discuss the meaning of virtue-y kind of guy, who would then build a temple just to prove his point. He was fascinated by the balance between power and beauty, between rule and reason. In his mind, the emperor wasn't just the head of state, he was the head of culture. And under Hadrian, Rome became a little less Roman and a lot more Greek. He filled the city with Hellenistic statues, commissioned Greek-style buildings, and even made Athens a sort of second capital. The Greeks adored him. They called him Hadrianos Olympios, the man who finished the long-delayed temple of Zeus in Athens after centuries of neglect. He was literally deified in Greece while still alive. Which is one way to get a 5-star Yelp review from the gods. But this Greek obsession didn't sit well with everyone. Traditional Romans grumbled that their emperor was too cosmopolitan, too philosophical, too artsy, too soft. They liked their emperors straightforward, conquer, tax, repeat. Hadrian preferred building libraries and writing poetry about lost love. It was, or not the Roman ideal. Still, he was too capable for anyone to really challenge him. And maybe that's why his reign feels so oddly modern, a ruler court between empire and introspection, performance and sincerity. Now, Hadrian's idea of empire wasn't expansion, it was consolidation. He wanted peace, not conquest. That sounds noble, but it was also pragmatic. The empire had reached its maximum stretch. Further conquest meant diminishing returns and endless rebellion. So Hadrian fortified, stabilized, and restructured. He toured every province, reorganized the military, improved roads, and standardized governance. He even introduced fairer treatment for soldiers, allowing them to retire with land and pensions. Essentially, he turned Rome from an adrenaline-fueled conqueror into a well-run corporation. The world's first bureaucratic empire. And, as with any bureaucracy, people complained it was boring. Which, ironically, is why historians now consider his reign one of the most peaceful and prosperous in Roman history. Hadrian's empire was calm, almost too calm. Like a house that looks perfect, but you just know the owner spent all night polishing the floor. Let's float forward a bit, into what happened after Hadrian. His chosen successor, Antoninus Pius, lived up to his name: patient, dutiful, pious. He kept things running smoothly, avoided wars, and worshipped Hadrian like a divine mentor. Hadrian's ashes were placed in that grand mausoleum by the Tiber, and Antoninus made sure his memory stayed polished. The cult of Antinous, meanwhile, slowly faded, though it lingered in Egypt and the Greek East for decades. The statues remained, serene, youthful, frozen in time, quietly haunting art history. Then came Marcus Aurelius, Hadrian's intellectual grandson in spirit. The philosopher-emperor who would write meditations while camped on the Danube, wrestling with the same stoic ideals that Hadrian had loved. In a way, Marcus was the product of Hadrian's design, his philosophical, humanistic vision for emperorship realized in its purest form. Hadrian didn't just build walls, he built a lineage of thinkers. But history has a sense of irony. After Marcus came Commodus, who preferred gladiator games to philosophy, and the empire began its long, slow crumble. Hadrian's carefully drawn borders blurred again. His vision of peace collapsed under the weight of ambition and entropy. And yet, his monuments stayed standing, silent reminders of what had once been possible when the empire had tasted. Let's drift a bit beyond the marble, into the myth. Hadrian's memory was always contested. For some, he was the ideal ruler, educated, peaceful, cultured. For others, he was a control freak with a god complex and an unhealthy attachment to a dead teenager. Both are true, in their own way. But that's what makes him interesting. He wasn't a monster or a saint. He was something far rarer in ancient history, a complicated human being with too much power and too much time to think. Later artists adored him. The Renaissance rediscovered his architecture and praised his taste. Enlightenment philosophers admired his intellect. Modern historians, though, can't help but see the cracks. The paranoia. The obsession with legacy. The grief turned into governance. And there's something oddly touching about that. Because even 2,000 years later, we recognize the impulse to build, to control, to memorialize what we can't keep. Hadrian was, in many ways, the emperor of impermanence. He built the Pantheon knowing even concrete decays. He built Antinopolis knowing cities fade. And yet, he built them anyway. That's the quiet beauty of his story. When you stand beneath the Pantheon's dome, or walk along the misty ruins of his wall, or see Antinous' face in a museum, you're seeing Hadrian's insomnia carved into stone. His need to make sense of things. To give grief a shape. To outbuild time. So, as we end tonight, let's imagine him one last time. Hadrian, wandering the corridors of his villa, tracing his fingers along the cool marble, listening to the echoes of his own footsteps. Somewhere, a statue of Antinous watches silently. Outside, the empire sleeps under the weight of its own perfection. And Hadrian, the philosopher-emperor, finally stops thinking. For once, he lets it all go. You followed us all the way through marble corridors and misty Roman front doors. So let's take a slow, deep breath. Because for this last part, We're going to zoom out, away from Hadrian himself, and drift through the echo he left behind. The pattern that repeats itself in palaces and thrones, century after century. The perfectionist's curse. Hadrian wasn't the first ruler to be consumed by his own need for control, and he definitely wasn't the last. He just made it look good in stone. Every era gets its Hadrian, a leader who tries to fix what can't be fixed, to impose order on the chaos of life. Someone who mistakes organization for peace, and architecture for immortality. You could trace his type through the centuries like a lineage of beautifully dressed exhaustion. There was Louis XIV in France, who turned his entire court into a stage play so perfect it drove him insane. There was Frederick the Great, another philosopher king, writing poetry between wars and worrying about whether his palace curtains were tasteful enough. Even in modern times, we still find echoes of Hadrian, people in power who think, if I can just design the world correctly, maybe I'll stop hurting inside. Of course, the world doesn't work that way. Empires fall. Walls crumble. And even marble gods eventually wither into dust. But Hadrian's story isn't really about failure. It's about that deeply human urge to leave something perfect behind, even when perfection is impossible. He tried to rule as a philosopher, but he lived as a man of grief. He loved beauty, but he couldn't love easily. He wanted peace, but his peace always came at the price of someone else's silence. It's the paradox of every ruler who builds monuments. The more they try to control, the more they reveal how fragile they really are. Imagine him again, in those last years at Tivoli, sitting beside one of his artificial ponds, the air heavy with cypress and still water. The empire stretches beyond the horizon, stable, peaceful, polished. And yet, he's alone with his thoughts, watching the light fade over the marble face of Antinous. You can almost hear him thinking, I built so much, and I still can't build peace inside myself. Maybe that's why his monuments endure. They aren't triumphs, they're confessions. The Pantheon's dome, with its perfect circle of sky, feels less like a symbol of power and more like a reminder that even the most calculated structure must open to the heavens. Hadrian's wall, stretching through the mist, feels like a sigh across the landscape, this far, and no further. Every stone is an admission of fatigue. Every arch a whisper of longing. And then there's Antinous. That eternal youth carved into 1,000 statues, always the same face, always the same quiet sadness. Hadrian tried to immortalize love, but what he really immortalized was loss. And maybe that's why we still look at those statues and feel something. Because grief is timeless. And beauty built from grief tends to last. When later emperors looked back on Hadrian, they saw different things. Antoninus Pius saw a wise mentor. Marcus Aurelius saw a kindred mind. The Senate saw an exhausting perfectionist. And posterity? Well, we see someone almost modern. Restless. Self-aware. Brilliant and unbearable in equal measure. If you read the fragments of his poetry, you catch glimpses of that modernity. One of his most famous verses is a short farewell to his own soul, written near his death. Little soul, wandering, pale and bare, guest and companion of the body, now you will go to places colorless, stiff and cold, where you will no longer joke as you used to. It's quiet, simple, and heartbreakingly tired. The kind of poem that could have been written by anyone who spent too long trying to hold the world together. And that's what makes it perfect. Even emperors, it turns out, end the same way we all do, talking softly to themselves in the dark. So maybe Hadrian's real legacy isn't the Pantheon or the wall or the city named after his lost love. Maybe it's the lesson that no amount of control can protect you from being human. That beauty and order are lovely distractions, but they never quite silence the ache underneath. And maybe, just maybe, that's okay. Because we remember him, don't we? We remember his voice in marble, his grief in stone, his impossible dream of a perfectly measured world. And in remembering, we give him what he wanted most, not immortality, but understanding. Let's drift out on that. The Emperor of Walls, sitting under a dome of stars. The tired builder who finally stopped building. The man who taught Rome to breathe for a while before it fell apart again. So, tonight, as you close your eyes, think of Hadrian. Not as a conqueror or a god, but as one of us. Someone who tried too hard to make things last. Someone who loved deeply and imperfectly. Someone who built his heartbreak into beauty so that strangers 2,000 years later could feel just a little less alone. Good night, Hadrian. Good night, Philosopher King. And good night to every tired perfectionist still trying to hold their own empire together.